Hello comrades, it's the Statian Bolshevik. I recently came across this video and I thought that it was simply too good to pass up. This video is by a right-wing libertarian who willingly calls himself Razor Fist. And of course, it's razor spelled with umlauts to make himself look more European. This guy is best known for being a reactionary, anti-SJW gamer/metalhead who got his ass handed to him in a debate with a known shill for the US Democratic Party, Backstreet Boys suck dem Kyle Kulinski. In this video, he tries to make the tired, old, and predictable talking point that the Nazis were somehow socialists, which is the talking point that you can expect from reactionary right-wing libertarians, despite the fact that anyone with even half a brain cell and who is also capable of doing any type of rigorous analysis would know that it's the exact opposite, and this right-wing Tommy Wiseau knockoff is clearly lying to you. A quick look at his video's thumbnails and titles quickly shows that he's just another sad case of the usual woke cringe, Democrats are evil and out to get Trump, and engages in unjust fear-mongering towards China while using overtly racist and xenophobic depictions of Xi Jinping. Highly original this charlatan Philistine is. Now, don't harass or bother this person, but listening to a few seconds of this garbage will make you quickly realize just how dishonest this sad person really is. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into this dumb horseshoe theory video from this epic gamer.
Nazis were socialists.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, shit. I mean, come on! Just look at this dude! This fucker is not only wearing biker leather gloves indoors, he's also wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses indoors while sitting behind his computer in a dark room. To paraphrase a quote from comedian Larry David, there's only two types of people that wear sunglasses indoors: blind people and assholes. And we can assume that Razor Fist here is the latter, considering the fact that this dude isn't blind. But let's just continue on with the video.
Just thought I'd flop that one right on your chin off the bat to frighten off all the ideologues.
Wait, is this guy seriously so full of himself to where he thinks that just simply stating the Nazis were socialists that it's gonna scare us Marxists off from debunking this stupid video? I really hate to burst your bubble here, Razor Fist, but it's gonna take a lot more than that to scare us off.
The party that became the Nazis existed even before the establishment of fascism, though in a greatly altered, infinitely more communistic form, as early as 1920 or so.
Already, I want to bash my brains in with a fucking baseball bat. Communistic form? What the fuck are you talking about? The pre-Hitler Nazi party that he was referring to, the German Workers' Party, as it was called, was always very staunchly anti-Marxist and anti-communist. And the reason why Hitler even joined this party in the first place was because of the fact of how vehemently anti-Marxist and anti-communist it was. And communism back then, much like how it is now, was always associated with Karl Marx and Marxism. Jesus Christ, we're not even 30 seconds in, and already this dude is way the fuck off course. God, I just want to take my copy of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds and bash it over my head a bunch of times, if it means that I don't have to sit through this horseshoe theory bullshit garbage.
But the authoritarian colossus we know from the 40s and 30s became what it was in direct response to the ascent of Italian fascism under Prime Minister and eventual dictator Benito Mussolini, from whom I will now quote. State intervention in economic production arises when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management. This is from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions, published in 1932, pages 135 to 136, in case you were fucking curious.
Of course, he's going to equate all form of state intervention in the economy as socialism, and of course he's willfully ignorant as to how dumb that argument actually is. What Mussolini is advocating here is for fascists to use the state to prop up capitalism. When private initiative isn't working under capitalism the way the capitalists want it to, the state should intervene on behalf of the national bourgeoisie and use violence if necessary to keep capitalism going. You can have the state to intervene on the behalf of the national bourgeoisie against the interests of the international bourgeoisie. And that's exactly what fascists like Hitler and Mussolini have always advocated for. That's precisely what fascism is. It's when capitalism uses militant, authoritarian, and reactionary means to prop itself up when in times of economic and political crises and decay. Capitalism on its own at that time was falling into deep economic crises and couldn't continue on in the old traditional way. In order to keep capitalism going, the state needed to 1. Intervene in the economy, and 2. Actively crush the growing workers' movement. Both of them, in tandem with each other, were needed to keep capitalism alive, and lo and behold, that's precisely what both Hitler and Mussolini did when they came to power. How the fuck is this socialism in any way, shape, or form? What this cherry-picked quote is advocating for here is far-right state capitalism. There's nothing socialist and or communistic about this. But let's continue on.
Outright seizing the means of production is the bedrock of socialism. Marxism, even.
No, it's not. Because you're leaving out a very important thing here, Razor Fist. Just who precisely is seizing the means of production, and who are they seizing the means of production on the behalf for? If fascists are the ones seizing the means of production, they're doing so on the behalf and for the sole benefit of their national bourgeoisie. And guess what? That's exactly what happened in both Germany and in Italy. Both Hitler and Mussolini went to all of the big businesses and industrial capitalists in their countries and said that if they were to both support and fund them, then they will do everything they can to support these big businesses and industrial capitalists. And once the fascists come to power, they will enact economic policies that will increase their corporate profits and commit acts of imperialism to further expand their markets and fulfill their colonial conquests. And that's precisely what they did.
Thyssen wrote a book called I Paid Hitler. The only man ever told the truth of the crowd. Now, Thyssen was Thyssen and the Krupps, these are the kind of people I'm talking about. Stinnes is the unknown man who was on the same rank, if not higher, than Thyssen and Krupp in those days. There was a general election in which they didn't collapse, but they suddenly fell, and the socialists took a big leap forward. I don't know which part.
1932.
Yes.
The Reichstag elections.
Yes, that was it. Now, I think this is the time when Thyssen and the rest must have had their meetings. You know, the Schroeder banks and and Thyssen and all the rest. Now, Stinnes also secretly was a big supplier of money for the Hitlerites. Stinnes, the richest man, I think he had 600,000 workers in his steel and coal plants. He also had an interest or owned 63 newspapers. He had a part interest in some of the four big banks. They were known as the D banks. You know, the Dresdner Bank, there were four big banks. They were known as the D banks. He had an interest in that.
And in return for receiving financial support from these big business owners and industrial capitalists, both Mussolini's Blackshirts and Hitler's Nazi stormtroopers, before they ever came to power, busted up all of the labor strikes, they smashed all the trade unions and co-ops, and they harassed and committed acts acts of terrorism against all of their political opponents and groups that were openly against the fascists in both countries. And it was always the communists that endured the harshest and most severe repression both during and after the fascists' rise to power. And all of this was funded by the big businesses and amongst the wealthiest individual capitalists because the fascists were obviously seen as the bulwark against communism. The communists wanted to get rid of the private ownership of the means of production, and the capitalists didn't want that because it would have obviously affected negatively for their profits, and it would have affected positively for the workers. So the capitalists sided with the fascists because they were the ones who fought for the private ownership of the means of production. In fact, let us even go back to that cherry-picked Mussolini quote that you showcased earlier. Is Mussolini in this quote strictly calling for the workers to seize the means of production? And is he calling for the strict abolition of private property? No, of course not. And when the fascists did come to power, they immediately enacted policies that can rightfully be described as a precursor to neoliberal austerity programs. Like how both Mussolini and Hitler's governments began to privatize all of the industries that were already state-owned. In fact, the term privatization was coined to describe the exact economic policies of both Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. They handed off all of the land and union property to rich private owners. And in addition to that, all of the minimum wage laws, overtime pay, and factory safety regulations were all abolished. This is all objective fact, so already your whole fucking argument falls apart. But let's continue on, otherwise we'll be here all fucking night.
Incidentally, the book I've just quoted, essentially the Bible of fascism, was largely ghostwritten by Giovanni Gentile, the scarcely acknowledged individual who actually conceived the concept of fascism in the first place.
No, that's not exactly what happened. Gentile and Mussolini didn't just come up with fascism out of nowhere and brought it to life overnight. That isn't how the real world works. Like if this guy were to actually read and analyze the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, for example, then he would realize that. Because Marx and Engels didn't just make their case and then called it quits. They established it by rigorously analyzing and proving how the real world works through their writings, using their method of analysis, which is dialectical materialism. Okay, this is where we start to get real in-depth into Marxist theories, so just bear with me for a second. Dialectical materialism is basically the study of motion to concretely understand that everything in the universe and in our concrete and real material world is matter, and all forms of matter are uniquely defined by its motion, how it moves, and how it interacts with the concrete material world, its environment, and nature. And this also extends to human thought, which is only advanced matter performing numerous functions in a constant state of motion, flux, and change. We analyze this using the dialectical method of Marx and Engels, which they developed from studying the philosophical system of G.W.F. Hegel. But Hegel was an idealist, meaning that the world that we're all experiencing right now is not the real world, because he believed that we experience the world in our own thoughts and minds. Basically, Hegel was more concerned with analyzing the world through human thought rather than analyzing the material, real world. So Hegel develops his system of dialectics, which to sum up means trying to reach the truth from arguing from both sides, to analyze and better understand the world from an idealist viewpoint. But where Marx and Engels differ and criticize Hegel was Hegel's idealism. This brings us to Ludwig Feuerbach, who was another philosopher that influenced both Marx and Engels. Feuerbach was the one who brought the concept of materialism to Hegel's dialectical method of analysis. Basically, materialism is the belief that our real physical world can best be understood by measuring and observing the world through provable scientific methods that we can witness through our senses in the concrete and material reality. The exact opposite of idealism. So Feuerbach was the first to bring Hegel's dialectical method into material analysis. But Marx and Engels were the ones that pointed out the inconsistency of Feuerbach's grasp on materialism. Feuerbach would sometimes present arguments using idealism, and sometimes he would use materialism. So with the dialectical system of Hegel and with the actual materialism of Feuerbach, Marx and Engels will root out all of the idealist notions of Hegel and Feuerbach to develop and create the underlying philosophical system of Marxism, which is dialectical materialism, or to sum up in a single sentence, means being able to dialectically argue about the world from a staunchly materialist point of view. But was Giovanni Gentile a dialectical materialist? No, he wasn't. Gentile was more influenced by Hegel's idealism, so much so that he was labeled at the time as a neo-Hegelian. To quote extensively from a Stalin-era Soviet college-level textbook on Marxist philosophy from 1941,
Hegel, in opposition to Kant, held that it is impossible to attribute contradiction to the subject alone. He insisted on the necessity of disclosing the contradictions in the very process of actuality, which was understood by him idealistically. Because in the strife of opposites he saw the root, the basis of every self-movement. But having set up this basic law of development, the idealist Hegel inevitably distorted and limited it. He held that the movement of the objective world is a form of movement of absolute spirit, and subordinated the development of objective processes to a system of categories made up in his own head. Thus, at every step, he betrayed the law he himself had set up. Being a bourgeois idealist and a German Philistine, he declared that in the idea, capital I, i.e. in the highest stage of development, contradictions are reconciled, a stoppage of development takes place. After depicting the movement of society as the development of the world's spirit through contradictions, he declared that in the Prussian monarchy, the highest incarnation of the state idea, social contradictions were reconciled. Thus, Hegel subordinated the revolutionary law of the struggle of opposites to the bourgeois theory of their reconciliation. Modern neo-Hegelians like Bradley and Gentile, the philosopher of fascism, act as did the reactionaries of Hegel's day. They seize on the reactionary side of the Hegelian philosophy and develop a theory of reconciliation of opposites. Marx and Engels, on the contrary, took from Hegel the same revolutionary side, reworked it critically, and developed the law of the unity and conflict of opposites. Lenin wrote, quote, "Consider such expressions as movement and self-movement, meaning spontaneous, internally necessary movement, change, movement and vitality, the principle of every self-movement, movement and action, in contrast to dead existence. And who will believe that these represent the very core of Hegel's frozen absolutism, as it has been called? It is necessary to disclose this essence, to understand it, to save it, to remove its shell, to cleanse it, and that is what Marx and Engels did."
This quote perfectly points out the idealism that was the main driving force of fascism that was developed by Giovanni Gentile and later put into practice by both Mussolini and Hitler. This idealism that Gentile was heavily influenced by was solely used by fascists to hang on to capitalism and defend the status quo, but not taking the revolutionary side of the struggle, which is the worker struggle. Instead, they reconciled with the big bourgeoisie. The whole intentional point of fascism is to try and damp down the proletarian class struggle and replace it with national struggle or racial struggle. The fascists want to get the working masses to look away from the class struggle and the revolution that must happen as a result of that struggle, and the fascists go to the bourgeois theory that you can just reconcile the class contradictions without the need for a proletarian socialist revolution. You can just have them coexisting and so on and so forth. So it's a theory of class collaboration in this context. This is the kind of philosophy that fascism naturally generated: class collaborationist, anti-working class, anti-proletarian revolutionary struggle, and reconciling rather than struggle between opposites. So Gentile, in this regard, is rightfully called a neo-Hegelian because Gentile was making the same kind of errors that Hegel made before, to an certain extent, Feuerbach, and then to a much greater extent Marx and Engels, came along and reworked it critically and rooted out all of the idealism that plagued Hegel's method of analysis. That is one of the core tenets of Marxism, that is to be staunchly anti-idealist, and fascists like Gentile, Mussolini, and Hitler used really abstract idealist notions and even implemented pseudo-history and science to justify their philosophy. Idealism isn't how the real world works. You don't just come up with an idea or thought in your head and then just poof it into existence. If you actually read Gentile's Doctrines of Fascism, it has nothing to do with what actually happened in Italy. But let's continue on with the video.
Gentile was a philosopher and at one point an outright Marxist.
Of course, he doesn't tell you that Gentile completely abandoned Marxism and instead started to embrace class collaboration and sided with the national bourgeoisie of Italy and used Hegelian idealism to justify so, which caused a resurgence in Hegelian idealism after being discredited for almost a century by Marx, Engels, and those Marxists that followed in their footsteps.
He was murdered 2 years before even Mussolini was by partisans.
Oh my god. I'm in a complete loss for words. Did this man literally just mock the partisans in Italy? The predominantly communist and leftist underground militia groups that took an active armed struggle against the fascists heroically? So if this douchebag is admitting that both Gentile and Mussolini were killed by the partisans and that the partisans were communists, doesn't that poke a hole in his dumb and provably false horseshoe theory argument that the fascists were the same as the communists? What really adds the cherry on top is this dude's unlikable, pompous attitude. The way this prick is holding himself by acting like he's talking down to everybody. Basically, he's so full of himself that he doesn't even realize that everything he thinks he knows is objectively wrong. And that's regardless of politics. And when people get that arrogant, pompous attitude, especially coming from people like Razorfist, like, bruh. And I don't like to play into that meme, but you need to go outside, touch grass, do anything productive, get your ass offline for a while, and go and get yourself a haircut. Oh, Jesus, who am I kidding? You're a clown.
The mistaken presumption that fascism is corporatism, so often espoused and re-espoused by so-called democratic socialists to demarcate themselves from the Nazi and fascist ideology their movement inevitably inspired.
Now, the so-called democratic socialists, who are really just social democrat reformers, did actually team up with the fascists and other non-leftist groups during that time. One of the most famous cases of social democrats teaming up with the fascists to spite and damage the actual hardline Marxist communists was in the case of the failed German socialist revolution from 1917 and 1918, and the social democrats ratted out great revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, whose brief faction in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and later their own party, the Spartacus League, were the only ones in the German Empire at the time that actively protested against World War I. And thanks to the liberal social democratic opportunist reformers that sided with the fascists instead of the hard-line communists, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were killed as a result. A really sad fact is that the very exact people that were responsible for killing Rosa Luxemburg, not only were they actual fascists, but they would later go on to become official members of the Nazi Party. If you want a proper Marxist deep dive into the failed German Socialist Revolution of 1918 to 1919, this 3-part video series from Bestie Marx is excellent. Otherwise, this other 3-part series from Jonas Cheka is also excellent. The main takeaway from this is that it was always the staunch, hardline communists that were always against fascism, as opposed to the social democratic reformers. But who am I kidding? This guy doesn't want to present any type of class analysis. Instead, he just cherry-picks historical events and quotes and presents them out of context to suit his dumb narrative, while also focusing on being a disgusting reactionary right-wing libertarian. I'm surprised that I haven't even roasted him yet for doing the Ben Shapiro tactic of talking really fast to sound smart or coming off as someone who knows what they're talking about. I swear, right-wing libertarians have got to be on speed, or at least some other type of stimulant, all the time. But the only difference between this asshat and Ben Shapipi is that this guy doesn't have that right-wing fracking billionaire cartel money funding him. At least that we know of. But let's continue on with the video.
Is based on a quote attributed to Mussolini in the Encyclopedia Italiana, and for the reasons I've just mentioned has seen heavy traffic in leftist circles.
Mussolini is quoted to have said that fascism is the union of state and corporate power. By that definition, can we claim that North America is anything but fascist? Well, that's not what my fellow Marxists would define fascism as. That's not even what most bourgeois historians would define fascism as. At least those who are somewhat honest and not just anti-communist propagandists. I feel like that this is a very selective quote here, Razor Fist.
It's even popped up in supposed history programs on TV and YouTube. You know who you fucking are.
He abandons his anti-capitalism to instead embrace private entrepreneurship with an element of syndicalism thrown in to give workers more influence without eliminating the traditional employer-employee relationship in a corporatist structure.
This is bullshit.
Wait, hold on a second. Is this guy seriously implying that Indy Neidell of the Great War and Time Ghost History Channel, who constantly spews anti-Soviet myths and anti-communist lies to the point where he actually distorts Marxism, is somehow left-wing? Oh, that's pretty fucking hilarious.
That quote is as follows. Fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power. The problem?
Now, before we continue, I just want to share something that I discovered while editing this video. Razor Fist here is so damn cocky with the gotcha remark that he's about to imply. You can actually hear him rubbing his leather gloved hands together. I just thought that was fucking funny.
The quote is apocryphal, outright fiction.
Now, it is true that Mussolini never said that quote, but fascism did have a corporatist structure. When most people hear the word corporatism, they usually think about it being corporations in league with the state, but that's very surface level of analysis. What a corporate was this idea that the fascist party had that they can just poof into existence a new relation of production on top of the already existing ones to moderate the class struggle and sort of act like the middle ground that would enforce class collaboration. So rather than the proletarian class struggle happening, they would have these corporates being the heads of industry from any company, like Fiat, for example, having seats in the fascist government. These were still very much bourgeois things, and it never worked out because you can't just create a new relation of production like that. They happen organically. They need to develop in an imminent way. This is very much fascist idealism rearing its ugly head. If you want another video by a Marxist properly defining and explaining what fascism actually is and what it was, check out this video by Comrade Hakim where he responds to another and every right-wing fracking billionaire's favorite right-wing libertarian stooge, Ben Shabibo.
It not only never appears in the Encyclopedia Italiana, but the statement is outright contradicted by several within the doctrine of fascism, like the one about seizing the means of production that I just quoted.
Alright, let us break down this real quote from Mussolini. Quote, "Fascism establishes the real equality of individuals before the nation. The object of the regime in the economic field is to ensure higher social justice for the whole of the Italian people." What does social justice mean? It means work guaranteed, fair wages, decent homes. It means the possibility of continuous evolution and improvement. End quote. Benito Mussolini from his Milan speech, 1933. First off, in Western and in fascist propaganda, when you see and or hear the term individuals, what this means is an elevation for the ownership of private bourgeois property. Fascists want to elevate private property rights above all other rights before the nation. Let us even use this great visual graphic explainer used by the late Italian Marxist intellectual and philosopher Domenico Lacerda that he used and developed to explain the thought and theory of Western liberalism at its very base, but I'm going to use it to explain fascist ideology, and you will quickly see how the two can very easily overlap. So you see here at the bottom, the roots of the tree represent individual mastery over private property, so private property rights. As it has been established time and time again, fascists have always fought and protected the right to own private bourgeois property, because their class interest is the same as the big national bourgeoisie of the fascists' own countries. Fascism is therefore rooted, no pun intended, in the protection of private ownership of the means of production, so much so that the economic policies of both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany were responsible for coining the term privatization. Next up, the trunk of the tree represents civil and political rights. In fascist countries like Mussolini's Italy and in Nazi Germany, those who had the most civil and political rights were those who were either members of the fascist parties and or those that were the big industrial capitalists and rich private owners of industry that supported and funded the fascists. And the people who had the least amount of civil and political rights were those that were either of a marginalized ethnic and or national minority group like Jewish people in Nazi Germany, for example, or those who were and spoke out against the fascists. And in both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, it was the communists who were and are the most outspoken and harshest critics of the fascists. And then at the very top, the leaves of the tree represent identity politics. Do I even have to explain this? Doesn't this seem kind of self-explanatory for fascists to use identity politics? Next, I'll show the Marxist tradition, and I'll use this to analyze fascist regimes as well. So you see here at the bottom, the roots of the tree represents anti-colonial sovereignty. So every nation has the right to govern themselves, and everybody in that said nation have a right to decide what type of government they want. Both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany weren't the result of the working masses voting in fascism. Let us refer to Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds. Mussolini was brought to power via a coup d'etat that was funded by the big businesses, rich private owners, and industrial capitalists. And it was also supported by the then King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III. Adolf Hitler, while being funded by Germany's rich industrial capitalists and big business owners, ran for president in 1932 against the conservative incumbent, who was the famed World War I general Paul von Hindenburg, and against the candidate from the Communist Party, Ernst Thälmann. During that campaign, Thälmann correctly warned that a vote for Hindenburg would have meant a vote for Hitler, and the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, at the 11th hour tried to form an anti-Nazi coalition with the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD. But staying true to form, the Social Democrats refused the proposal by the Communists to form an anti-Nazi coalition, and the Social Democrats instead allied themselves with the parties on the reactionary right. The result of the national election, which was held in late 1932, ended up with the Nazis receiving 37.3% of the vote, the highest they ever won in a democratic national election. But that didn't matter anyway, because a few weeks later, in January of 1933, Hindenburg, who won the election, appointed Hitler to the chancellorship. How is it democratic for a political party to be the one in power despite never receiving the majority of support and was solely supported by the minority of the population who are rich big business owners and big industrial capitalists? And when these fascists did come to power in Italy and Germany, both fascist governments didn't respect the sovereignty of other nations. Italy, even before fascist rule, had colonized Libya in 1911, which the fascists inherited when they came to power, and thus Libya remained a colony of Italy until 1943. And fascist Italy also had other colonies in conquered territories, like in Ethiopia and in the Balkans, most notably Albania. And the same is true for Nazi Germany. The Nazis had completely and illegally annexed Austria and invaded Czechoslovakia before the outbreak of World War II, which is something that Hitler did with the full blessing and approval of the capitalist West, whilst the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, had been trying to form an anti-Nazi military alliance with the UK and France numerous times, including a Soviet proposal to send over 1 million Soviet Red Army troops to the German-Polish border in the event where a war was to break out between Nazi Germany and the rest of Europe. But this proposal didn't happen due to Poland's hatred of the USSR. And because of this hatred, Poland wouldn't allow a single Soviet Red Army deterrence force into their country. And the Soviet Union respected Poland's refusal. This was because the Soviets, while knowing that they were going to be invaded for the past 10 years, actually wanted peace, because the Soviets were practicing a policy of building socialism in one country. In order to successfully build socialism in one country, the Soviets needed and wanted peace, hence why they didn't implement any warmongering policies, unlike Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Getting back to Lucerto's tree, you can see here that the trunk of the tree represents the right to economic well-being, something that both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy only guaranteed to those who were rich private capitalists and big industrial business owners, not the workers. Again, referring to PARENTI'S, Blackshirts, and Reds, both Mussolini and Hitler, as a way of saying thank you to their big business patrons, began to privatize many of the perfectly solvent state-owned industries, like steel mills, power plants, banks, and steamship companies, all while dipping into the public treasury to subsidize heavy industry. All of the union properties and farm co-ops were confiscated by the fascist governments and were handed off to rich private owners. All of the minimum wage laws, overtime pay, and factory safety regulations were all abolished. The workers toiled longer hours for less pay. The wages in both countries, which were already modest to begin with, were severely cut. In Nazi Germany, by 25 to 40%, and in Fascist Italy, by 50%. In fact, in Fascist Italy, child labor was brought back. What was the result of all this? In Fascist Italy, during the 1930s, the economy was gripped by recession, it had accumulated a staggering public debt, and there was widespread political corruption. But industrial profits rose, and the armament factories were busily rolling out weapons in preparation for the war to come. In Nazi Germany, even though unemployment was cut in half, thanks to the rampant expansion in the armament sector due to the severe militarism, but overall poverty increased due to the drastic cuts in wages. And from 1935 to 1943, industrial profits increased substantially while the net income for the corporate leaders climbed 46%. You can see here who, under fascist regimes, had the right to economic well-being. It certainly wasn't the industrial workers or the peasant farmers in the rural countryside who make up the majority of any given nation. And then at the top, the leaves of the tree represent civil, political, cultural, and environmental rights. Under fascism, if you were anybody that wasn't a member or at least supported the fascist parties, if you weren't a rich industrial capitalist, if you were a communist or any other type of anti-fascist, if you were a worker, and if you were of any type of ethnic and/or national minority group, then you would have had no type of civil, political, cultural, and/or environmental rights. Which is a perfect segue to talk about this next part of the quote. The object of the regime in the economic field is to ensure higher social justice for the whole of the Italian people. So here's another point to consider here, Razor Fist. Socialism and communism, in the Marxist sense, is international. Now, we all know that Razor Fist here is too lazy to read Marxist books in full, and instead he cherry-picks quotes and historical events and presents them out of context. But Marxist socialism and communism is internationally minded. So this far-right racist chauvinism and nationalism especially amongst first world colonizing nations like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, have absolutely no place in Marxism. So you trying to put this on the same level with communism is fucking wrong and absolutely hilarious. And what does social justice mean to a fucking fascistic dipshit jerk-off like Mussolini? It means work guaranteed. But work under and for who? And under what conditions? And dictated by who? The fascist state, controlled and supported by the bourgeoisie. That is very reactionary. So have fun working in a fascistic hell state where you'll work more for less. And fair wages. Again, dictated and controlled by who? Decent homes, dictated by who? It's going to be controlled and dictated by the fascist state. And fascists have shown time after time that they have a need and want to expand. They need Lebensraum. They need Spazio Fatale. And so they need to go outward and commit acts of imperialism and colonialism to expand their own and take over foreign markets and labor forces. And so when the funds for that start to run out, you can kiss your fair wages and decent homes goodbye. And now for the last part of the quote. It means the responsibility of continuous evolution and improvement. Yeah, for the big national bourgeoisie and for the military sector, which is once again controlled by the rich capitalists. This quote is just a cover scheme for far-right state capitalism to suppress any real revolutionary proletarian workers' struggle.
But we're not here to talk about fascists in Italy or otherwise, or how fellow travelers have set about erasing the socialistic origins of Mussolini's rise. We have noxious gender studies majors with more hair colors than personality traits for that.
Do y'all see what I mean with the whole anti-SJW reactionary bullshit yet? I wouldn't be surprised if this guy is an avid admirer of Jordan Peterson. Also, what college freshman radlib is out here saying that Mussolini was never a socialist? Because most of the people that this guy thinks are socialists or radical leftists, like social democrats like Bernie Sanders or AOC, and your regular run-of-the-mill Democrats like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, are very much staunchly anti-communists that want to preserve capitalism. Just one side wants more social welfare spending than the other. Another issue from this is that Mussolini and a lot of fascism sort of comes out of the same middle class or petty bourgeois milieu that is also attracted to radical liberalism. Also, a lot of the Italian fascists at that time came out of anarchism as well. One of the many issues of that is that those very same anarchists at that time were never like a left or right in mentality. So basically, centrist. That wasn't how people view things at all, at least back then. And that's one of the many things that this prick and many of those right-wingers who identify as either libertarian, centrist, or even anarcho-capitalist doesn't get. Guess where those concepts come from? The same exact place. And it was always the hardline communists that were and are opposed to it. If you want a further Marxist deep dive into how centrism, anarcho-capitalism, and libertarianism actually serves the far right, these videos by Comrades Fellow Traveler and JT from Second Thought are excellent. And this slightly related video by Comrade Reese is also worth checking out. Now let us address the point that Razor Fist here stated about the socialistic origins of Mussolini. Now it is true that Mussolini used to be a socialist. Keywords being used to. Before Mussolini founded the National Fascist Party of Italy, he was a member of the Italian Socialist Party. Now, no Marxist worth a damn has never denied that, because to do so would be to deny reality and any type of material analysis. And again, referring to Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, quote, before World War I, Mussolini was a socialist, an editor of the party's official newspaper, a brilliant organizer, agitator, and a gifted journalist. Yet many of his comrades suspected him of being less interested in advancing socialism than in advancing himself. Indeed, when the Italian upper class tempted him with recognition, financial support, and the promise of power, he didn't hesitate to switch sides. End quote. So already, Mussolini was a socialist in the very loose sense of the term, while his contemporaries were warning others saying, hey, don't trust this guy, he's an opportunist. Quote, by the end of World War I, Mussolini the socialist, who had organized strikes for workers and peasants, had become Mussolini the fascist, who broke strikes on behalf of financiers and landowners. Using the huge sums he received from wealthy interests, he projected himself onto the national scene as the acknowledged leader of I Fasci di Combattimento, composed of black-shirted ex-army officers and sundry tops who were guided by no clear political doctrine than a militaristic patriotism and conservative dislike for anything associated with socialism and organized labor. End quote. Wow, it's almost like that he was a human being who was also a bastard corporate sellout because of the fact that he was an opportunist, which is what the Marxists at the time thought and criticized Mussolini for. If you want a good Marxist critique of Mussolini, check out the works of Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, more specifically, the selections from Gramsci's prison notebooks that he wrote during his time in prison in fascist Italy for being a communist. In other words, read what the Marxists at the time were writing about fascists like Mussolini in their own country. Otherwise, you get libertarians like Razorfist here saying that all the Marxists at the time supported Mussolini without realizing how much of a blatant lie that is. Now let's briefly go over this cherry-picked quote that Razorfist here has provided for us. Quote, the outbreak of a socialist revolution in one country would cause the others to imitate it, or so to strengthen the proletariat as to prevent its national bourgeoisie from attempting any armed intervention. End quote. Benito Mussolini from The Myth of the Nation and the Vision of Revolution. Again, you can see here the very selective tendency that Razorfist here has to quote things out of context to suit his own narrative. Even this quote on its own isn't even an endorsement of socialism. Given with what we know on how Mussolini came to power, wouldn't it make more sense for this quote to be seen as a warning from Mussolini to the Italian national bourgeoisie that supported and funded him? Saying that if you aren't strengthened and don't make any effort to strengthen yourselves, then an outbreak of a proletarian socialist revolution could happen? But then again, the enlightened right-wing libertarian Razorfist here doesn't provide any context for this quote here, or any of the quotes that he already used or will use. The sheer dishonest brain rot is rearing its ugly head yet again. But let's continue.
Let's rap about Nazis, shall we? Literally, Hitler's Germany, like Mussolini's Italy, reserved the right to seize the means of production should it become unproductive. Hence, the government shall intervene when incentive is lacking quote I reference from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions. Both Italy and Germany retained this policy, though the cooperation of private industry under threat of seizure and violence meant they were rarely forced to actually employ it. But make no mistake, the threat was real.
Did you catch that? The threat was real, even though the fascists never went through with it because private industry thrived under fascism. You fucking dumbass! Didn't you notice this contradiction when you were planning out this video, bro? You literally just admitted that privatized industry thrived under fascism, yet here you are in a dark room with biker leather gloves and sunglasses on, sitting behind your computer, and you want to call these fascists communists and socialists. Oh god, that's fucking hilarious. Lord knows I needed a good laugh today. Also, that threat that he was talking about for the state to intervene once private industry becomes unproductive, that threat is always there. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? The threat for the state to intervene in the economy is something that every state in the history of statehood has and has done. Even the current US government maintains that right. Even though the current US government isn't a fascist state, it's a liberal democracy, it maintains that right, and it has done that in the past. The biggest example of this in recent memory was when the US government bailed out all of the big banks and businesses that were deemed too big to fail during the 2008 and 2009 Great Recession. But the US government rarely uses state intervention, but only does so if it means maintaining the big bourgeoisie.
In fact, the 25-point economic plan of the Nazi Party included the following, quote, the nationalization of all trusts, profit sharing in large industries, and an agrarian reform in accordance with our national requirements, and the enactment of a law to expropriate owners without compensation of any land needed for the common purpose, the abolition of ground rents, and the prohibition of all speculation in land. A particularly alarming one was also, quote, we demand the immediate communalization of large stores which will be rented cheaply to small tradespeople.
Now, this is just another perfect example of right-wing libertarians going back through history and selectively cherry-picking either historical events or quotes and present them out of context to fallaciously make their argument. Like just looking at the economy, which every economy ever is a mixed economy. There's never been a capitalist experiment without a state, which is what these right-wing libertarians and anarcho-capitalist idiots believe in. Stateless capitalism that these dumb fucks invented in their heads. They just cherry-pick anywhere in the economy where the government was involved in, and they say, see, they had socialism. But when you know what socialism actually is, it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, it's a worker state, you're transitioning towards worker democracy, towards full ownership of the means of production by the working class, and it's also a transitionary period from capitalism towards full communism, that is a stateless, moneyless, and classless society where everyone in a post-scarcity world becomes a free producer under the banner of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That is, unless if you're not physically and or mentally able to work, of course. By then, your needs will be taken care of. But when looking at this, does it say anywhere in this program that the working masses are going to have full ownership of the means of production? Or is it just a few places where the government is involved in industry and agriculture? This is the mindset of right-wing libertarians. They see where in the economy where the government is involved in production, and they say that it's socialist. It's literally the Richard Wolff meme.
Socialism is when the government does stuff. And it's more socialism the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism.
I'm sorry, comrades. I just couldn't resist. Also, when the fascist state would intervene, ask yourself this question. Who did the fascists took property from, and who were they giving it to? Again, referring to Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, both Hitler and Mussolini privatized all of the state-owned businesses and handed them over to the rich private owners that supported the fascists. They cut taxes on these newly privatized businesses that were now owned by the fascist-supporting rich people, while increasing taxes on the general populace. And while they did this, the fascists enriched themselves at every opportunity. The Italian and German fascists lived lavishly. They associated themselves with the higher circles of the wealthy and aristocracy. Nazi officials and SS commanders amassed personal fortunes by stealing from concentration camp inmates and other political victims. They made huge amounts of money from secretly owned, well-connected businesses and from contracting out camp slave labor to industrial firms like IG Farben and Krupp. Even Hitler lived luxuriously. He expropriated artworks from the public domain and passed them off as his own. He stole enormous sums from Nazi Party donors and coffers. He invented a new concept called the personality right that enabled him to charge a small fee for every postage stamp with his likeness on it, which made him hundreds of millions of Deutschmarks, and his greatest source of wealth was a secret slush fund which leading German industrialists regularly donated to. Hitler knew that as long as German industry was making money, his private money sources would be inexhaustible. Thus, he see to it that German industry was never better off than under his rule by launching, for one thing, gigantic armament projects, or what we would call today, fat defense contracts. During his tenure as dictator of Nazi Germany, Hitler got special rulings from the German tax office that allowed him to avoid paying any kind of income or property taxes. He had a motor pool of limousines, private apartments, country homes, a vast staff of servants, and a majestic estate in the Alps. Getting back to the topic at hand, when it always comes down to these cherry-picked things that I've been pointing out throughout this video, it's always anarcho-capitalists and any other type of right-wing libertarians, like Razor Fist here. They always take one section of anything, no matter how small, and they either are too lazy to read or, even more insidiously, intentionally not looking at the entire thing just to make their argument that these idiots have already preemptively came to in their heads without drawing any conclusions from doing any type of rigorous analysis. Like, even with this, Razor Fist here is just looking at a list. He doesn't even look at the whole thing and the actual history of this. But let us actually look at this fascist party program. In none of these demands do we see a reflection of what can be considered a step towards the liberation of the proletariat. Like the nationalization of trusts, that's something that can occur under a capitalist system. And profit sharing in large industries, that too can happen under a capitalist system. In fact, profit sharing is something that capitalists use to keep the more ignorant, for lack of a better word, and non-class conscious workers away from the class movement and away from developing their political and class consciousness, and thus make them serve as a support of capital. How it works is that the capitalist will lower the basic wage and justifies so by stating that the worker is supposedly also interested in having the business profitable. Then, under the guise of a share in the profits, only a part of the wages that were previously deducted is returned to the worker. In the end, the workers sharing the profits often receive less than the workers who work simply for regular wages. Getting back on track, all of these things can happen under a state capitalist system. This doesn't imply socialism in any way. Also, take a look at points 3 and 4. 3. We demand land and territory, colonies, in parentheses, for the maintenance of our people and the settlement of our surplus population. Point 4. Only those who are our fellow countrymen can become citizens. Only those who have German blood, regardless of creed, can be our countrymen. Hence, no Jew can be a countryman. This settler colonialism and this racial supremacy has no place in Marxism. And this last point basically says that this can only apply to those who identify as ethnically German. This serves only to further divide the working class and solidify the national bourgeoisie's placement of power at the very top of society. I'm getting very sick and tired of this cherry-picked bullshit and lack of critical thinking. And not to sound like a broken record, but Razor Fist doesn't once mention all of the already state-owned public industries that were privatized, especially in Germany, that were handed over to rich private individuals and corporations that helped Hitler rise to power, including, but not limited to, Prescott Bush, the father of former US President and CIA Director George H.W. Bush, and the grandfather of former US President George W. Bush. The fascists took all of these nationalized industries that were functioning modestly and fine for years that paid for all of the pre-existing social safety nets and dismantled them, and they moved towards corporatism. Is that socialism, Razor Fist? Why aren't you talking about that? Oh wait, it's because you're a reactionary charlatan who is talking out of your fat hairy ass.
A law that wouldn't look a bit out of place at a Seattle City Council meeting.
Oh yeah, because we all know the socialist hellscape that is Seattle, Washington. What the fuck is this reactionary bullshit? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Seattle isn't a Marxist-Leninist socialist republic. Jesus. The cognitive dissonance of right-wing anti-communists knows no bounds.
socialist policies all, which wasn't surprising. Gottfried Feder, who first drafted them, was an adamant anti-capitalist. He was later made the economic planner under Hitler and the Nazis, as was Ferdinand Zimmermann, aka Ferdinand Fried. Reading Fried's writings in Die Tat illuminates the socialistic underpinnings of National Socialism whole cloth. He also wrote a book entitled Das Ende des Kapitalismus, a title I'm sure I don't need to translate.
Why are you the way that you are?
God, he really is just talking so fast to the point where he's hoping that people don't realize how weak his arguments are. So Razorfist here said that Gottfried Feder was both an economic planner for the Nazis and was a self-proclaimed anti-capitalist. Okay, but you've established previously that the whole thesis of your stupid video is that fascism and communism were one and the same thing. So with this guy being a self-proclaimed anti-capitalist, what does that really mean? Was this dipshit a staunch Marxist? Was he a part of the Communist Party of Germany? Was it the Communist Party that teamed up with Hitler and the Nazis, and that's when he became the economic planner under Schittler? Or was this guy, and all of those in the Nazi Party who called themselves anti-capitalists, really just political opportunists who never really cared about anti-capitalism in the first place anyways, and sided with Hitler when he rose to power because of the changing material conditions that allowed fascism to gain prominence in a time of capitalist crises and decay? The answer is obviously the latter, and it was always the organized Marxist communists that were opposed and staunchly against fascism every damn step of the way, in every country that either went fascist or were occupied by fascists, and it was the Soviet Red Army and the communist partisans in the entirety of Eastern Europe, like in Yugoslavia for example, that defeated the fascists. But don't expect this kind of analysis from someone like Razorfist here. This guy literally draws his conclusions from glancing at them at face value. Razorfist will be like, well, this guy said that he was an anti-capitalist, and he was the economic planner under Hitler. Aha! I did it! I fallaciously proved that communism and fascism are one and the same thing! I used my big brain today! Pip pip da doodly doo! Shout out to the ghost of Hannah Arendt. Like, no. You haven't proved anything except the following 3 things. 1. Jack shit. 2. That you don't know how to do a class analysis or at least a rigorous and thorough investigation. And 3. You proved to the entire goddamn internet that you don't know how to read. You fucking idiot. Another perfect example of Razorfist here literally taking things at face value was his citing of this book by Ferdinand Fried, that of course Razorfist doesn't quote from. Now, I tried searching far and wide for a free PDF of an English translation of this book so I can quote it at length from the horse's mouth that this book is in no way calling for the end of capitalism, like what Razorfist here is implying. And guess what? I can't find a free PDF of an English translation of this Nazi book that's available on the internet. But I did, however, find PDFs of this book that's available for free via the Internet Archive. But the PDFs of this book that are on the Internet Archive are in Italian, and I don't speak and or read in Italian, and I doubt that Razorfist here can read in Italian as well. So with that being said, this dude just puts forward his own assumptions before anything else, which is a incorrect way of examining the real world. Which is what these right-wing libertarian types often do. They have these preconceived notions and assumptions in their head, and then they draw backwards from their conclusions by going back through history, and then they cherry-pick historical events and quotes and present them out of context to make their argument. And Razorfist here has proven that. Wait a second. How long have we made it into the video? Holy shit! We're not even 5 minutes into this horseshoe theory video. That's it. I'm gonna have to call it a day. I'm gonna have to split this response into 2 parts. Potentially 3. Well, as a final note, I'll end with this. This rant/response to this right-wing libertarian Tommy Wiseau knockoff really reminds me of 2 very distinct things. One is the opening passage to Oppose Book Worship by Chairman Mao Zedong. No investigation, no right to speak. Unless you have investigated a problem, you will be deprived of the right to speak on it. Isn't that too harsh? Not in the least. When you have not probed into a problem, into the present facts and its past history, and know nothing of its essentials, whatever you say about it will undoubtedly be nonsense. Talking nonsense solves no problems, as everyone knows, so why is it unjust to deprive you of the right to speak? Quite a few comrades always keep their eyes shut and talk nonsense. And for a communist, that is disgraceful. How can a communist keep his eyes shut and talk nonsense? It won't do. It won't do. You must investigate, and you must not talk nonsense. The second thing that this reminds me of is this clip, which perfectly sums up libertarian ideology.
Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Hell no!
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
I'm sorry, comrades. I just couldn't resist. I just love showcasing that clip whenever I get the chance. And that is all that I have for you today. If you liked this video, be sure to leave a like and be sure to subscribe to my channel. That is, if you want to. And be sure to hit the notification bell icon and turn on your notifications so you won't miss any time that I post something on my channel. So until next time, comrades, take care, continue to read Marxist theory, don't let the capitalist bastards grind you down, and remember, no investigation, no right to speak and critique, in solidarity, comrades.